Good morning. I'm pre-recording this obviously from my living room. If you hear any loud noises, it's my African gray parrot in the next room. Hopefully he'll stay quiet through the duration. The text I'll be reading from comes from the Old Testament, book of Joshua, chapter 4, verses 5 through 7. Take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over Jordan. The waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. I'll begin with a quick summary of the text I've chosen. 40 years prior, the Israelites began their exodus out of the land of Egypt, where they'd been slaves for 400 years. I won't go into the details of the story. I'll assume we all know the basics, either from our own studies, childhood Sunday school lessons, or, if nothing else, from the 1956 Charlton Heston blockbuster, The 10 Commandments. The book of Joshua is sort of the sequel to the story. Moses has led the Israelites out of Egypt. Now Joshua leads them into Canaan. And he begins the conquest by repeating the miracle that made Moses famous, parting the waters, this time not of the Red Sea, but of the Jordan River, so that the people can enter into what they see as their promised land. Seeing the need to commemorate this miraculous event, Joshua commands the people to gather 12 stones that will serve as a monument to their divine entry into Canaan. When their children ask, Hey Dad, what do these stones mean? There was only one acceptable answer a man could give his son, that these stones are a monument to conquest. These stones represent our divine right to occupy this land. But the romanticized story that Joshua imagined fathers would share with their sons ignores one key fact, that the land they would soon occupy was, in fact, already occupied. For those who already occupied the land, the 12 stones also held meaning, but the meaning was quite different. So while the Israelite father would look to this monument and tell his son the stones represent our inheritance, the Canaanite father would tell his son these stones represent our displacement. The Israelite looked at this monument and saw triumph, but the Canaanite saw a monument to genocide. To the Israelite, the stones symbolized God's favor, but to the Canaanite, they were a reminder of the pain and destruction inflicted upon them as they were driven from their land. One father would show these stones to his son to evoke memories of triumph and victory, but another father would hope his son never laid eyes on them, because these stones were a painful memory of a time of violence and loss. No matter how much the dominant culture might tell that father what he was supposed to feel when he saw those stones, the monument did not match his memory. Throughout history, every society has built its monuments. The Moai of Easter Island, the Apennine Colossus of Italy, Tirthankara of India. Every age and every nation have established their monuments. Even a nation as young as ours is permeated with monuments. From small towns to great cities, coast to coast, we've laid down our metaphorical stones. Monuments can, of course, be literal, physical structures, but they can also exist in the days we celebrate, our institutions and social structures, the ideas and values that shape our collective identity. Whether literal or figurative, monuments are erected to immortalize society's values and history, but more importantly, monuments define and shape the historical narrative. Often the goal in shaping that narrative is not to be accurate, but to create a monument in the image of its maker. In any society, it is those with power who build its monuments, not to portray truth, but to reflect the values and tell the stories of the dominant culture. Meanwhile, the experience of marginalized people are often misconstrued or altogether omitted. Their stories are untold. Their voices are unheard. So as they behold the monuments that define the collective identity of the nation, the image they see does not reflect their values. As they read the inscriptions of history, their memories do not match the monuments. In 1970, on the 350th anniversary of the settlement of Plymouth Colony, descendants of those who arrived on the Mayflower planned a celebration, which would include an official state dinner and a reenactment of the first Thanksgiving. But the planners of the event soon realized that the event was missing just one thing. What the celebration needed was an Indian. So they decided to invite a native leader to give a speech in honor of their Puritan ancestors. They contacted Frank B. James, a Wampanoag elder, and asked him to do this honor. He accepted and began to pen his speech for the occasion. But before the celebration, the event planners asked Mr. James to preview his speech. And after reading it, they presented him with another speech to read, one crafted by a public relations expert. But as Mr. James examined the speech written by this public relations agent, he saw an expertly crafted monument, but one that did not coincide with the memory of the Wampanoag and other indigenous people. The monument they asked Mr. James to present is one with which we're all too familiar. The story of a Thanksgiving dinner where brave pilgrims break bread with local natives. Then after dinner, the natives fade into the distance forever, never to be seen or heard from again. The memory of indigenous people stands in stark contrast to this monument. While oral tradition does suggest that a 3-day gathering of Puritans and the Wampanoag did possibly occur, the story does not end there, nor was this a Thanksgiving celebration. The first official Thanksgiving in the Americas, proclaimed 16 years later by Governor William Bradford, was not a gathering of colonist and indigenous people, but the celebration of ethnic cleansing. In his book Of Plymouth Plantation, Bradford plainly and horrifically describes the slaughter of 700 Pequot Indians, mostly women and children. It was after this brutal massacre that Governor Bradford proclaimed, using his own words, "A day of thanksgiving kept in all the churches for our victories against the Pequots." Though this was the first official proclaimed day of Thanksgiving in the Americas, the monument we chose to build presents a romanticized version of history that ignores the 700 massacred Pequot men, women, and children. When Frank B. James informed the planners of the 350th anniversary celebration that he would not dishonor his and other indigenous people's ancestors by giving credence to a monument built on mythology, his invitation was rescinded. Instead of attending the formal state dinner, on the fourth Thursday of November 1970, he and other Native people gathered for the first time on Coles Hill in Plymouth to give voice to the memory of their ancestors on what became known as the National Day of Mourning. Several years ago, I decided as a Native person that I would no longer celebrate the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday, but instead on the fourth Thursday of November observe the National Day of Mourning. 2 years ago, I decided to join with my brothers and sisters in New England, and I made my pilgrimage to Plymouth, Massachusetts, where I was privileged to stand on Coles Hill for the 49th annual National Day of Mourning. Mr. Frank James had passed on, but his son told his story to a gathering of people from throughout the nation. Native people from various tribes, as well as non-native allies, stood together in 14-degree temperatures, the icy wind blowing off the water, cutting through my wool coat and the 4 pairs of socks I was wearing. But the frigid temperatures did not deter us from our purpose. We were gathered for the same reason Mr. Frank James and others gathered in 1970. We were there to speak the truth not found on the inscriptions of monuments. We gathered to tell the stories of our ancestors, because if we are to honor our ancestors, we cannot allow their experiences to be forgotten. When I told my students my plans for the holiday break, one of my students asked, "Mr. Tawes, what's your problem with Thanksgiving? What do you have against mac and cheese and deep-fried turkey?" But you see, I didn't drive 1,100 miles and stand on a hill in the freezing cold because I have a problem with Thanksgiving. As you can see from my appearance, I have no qualms with macaroni and cheese, and as a Southern boy born and bred, I've never met anything deep-fried that I did not like. My purpose for observing the National Day of Mourning and my message today is not that I oppose Thanksgiving or that anyone should feel even the slightest tinge of guilt over your Thanksgiving tradition. My message is quite the opposite. Standing on that cold hill in Plymouth for the first time, the sound of the drumbeat and the smell of burning sage drifting through the air, as we turned to each of the 4 directions to offer prayer, I began to think and reflect on my ancestors. My Kusso ancestors, indigenous to the low country of South Carolina, who were attacked and enslaved by British settlers. My Natchez ancestors, driven from their homeland by the French, forced to seek refuge among other native tribes, one group of them eventually finding refuge among the Kusso. As I thought about their plight, I was overwhelmed with emotion, but it wasn't anger or resentment that I felt. I was overwhelmed with a sense of thankfulness. Thankful to descend from men and women who could endure the most extreme circumstances, so that when I encounter difficulty, I remind myself that I descend from the survivors of genocide. Thankful that despite everything they lost, one thing they did not lose was a rich, sacred culture, and they passed that down to me. Thankful that those who came before me, against all odds, especially as an East Coast tribe who experienced colonization early on, were somehow able to maintain our identity as a people, a closely knit tribal community that I'm proud and thankful to be part of. Though I gathered for a day of mourning, I found that by tearing down monuments to mythology and embracing truth, the fourth Thursday of November became a genuine day of Thanksgiving for me. So I would never suggest that there's anything wrong with the celebration of Thanksgiving. What I'm proposing is that regardless of what holiday you celebrate, no matter what your customs or tradition, you can have the celebration without propagating the myth. That's exactly what the librarians of McQuaid Library, Merrimack College in Massachusetts sought to do a few years ago. On their Facebook page, librarians posted a list of resources for teaching children about Thanksgiving. Among an array of educational links, they included a link to the United American Indians of New England webpage with a National Day of Mourning hashtag. This rather simple Facebook post was soon flooded with replies after the media outlet The Blaze ran a story accusing school librarians of attacking Thanksgiving by referring to it as a day of mourning. There was no ambiguity about in the library's post, so it's obvious the staff of The Blaze did not misunderstand the librarian's message or intent. They were not calling the Thanksgiving holiday a day of mourning as the article deceptively suggested. The article was in no way attacking or criticizing the Thanksgiving holiday or its associated traditions. They were not declaring a war on Thanksgiving. They were merely providing the public with resources about Thanksgiving that included the voices of Native people. Yet the writers of The Blaze and many of its readers saw this as a threat. I would say this comes as a surprise to me, but unfortunately I've encountered similar backlash. The first year that I chose to observe the National Day of Mourning, I told a friend that I planned to spend the day fasting and reflecting on the history of my people. She responded by calling me unthankful and telling me that I was promoting the decline of our nation. That same year, I tweeted that I wished I could be in Plymouth for the hashtag National Day of Mourning, and my notifications were soon flooded with some of the most angry, hate-filled rhetoric I have ever seen, even on Twitter. No matter how I tried to reason with people and explain that my decision to remember my ancestors on this day is not an attack on their holiday or traditions, I was still met with vitriolic responses. I've concluded that the reason for such resentment to a librarian's Facebook post or to me speaking of my experience as a Native person is that the inclusion of a Native voice doesn't fit in with the monument with which we're so familiar, and people love their monuments. If there's anything I learned growing up in South Carolina, it's that society's monuments are beloved. My senior year at College of Charleston, I made the unwise decision to not pay for a parking place. I had early classes, so I thought I'd just park on the street. I soon learned that I would be walking at least a mile every day to class. But during that semester, I became more familiar than ever with Charleston, South Carolina, and I learned that the Holy City is a city that loves its monuments. On especially tough parking days, my walk began at the southern tip of the peninsula, better known as the Battery, a name it received as the site for a Civil War defense artillery battle. There, I also passed the monument to the Confederate defenders. On the long walk up Meeting Street, I passed the home of John C. Calhoun. Then I later took a left on Calhoun Street, where a prominent statue of John C. Calhoun is displayed. Sitting alongside Calhoun's statue is a memorial to Wade Hampton. Though John C. Calhoun's rhetoric is so divisive and violent that the Gullah Geechee community in Charleston refers to the street that bears his name as Killoon Street. Though Hampton literally took the lives of numerous African Americans, the suggestion of removing or even relocating either of these monuments is met with intense hostility. Monuments shape our identity. So when people see a threat to their monument, they see it as a threat to them personally. I remember in the 1990s when the Confederate battle flag issue first came to a head in South Carolina. I was in high school. I vividly recall the hostility stirred by this debate. At one point on my high school campus, a series of fights broke out when a few students decided to bring their Confederate flags to school and wave them around campus. The most that we were able to accomplish back then was to take the flag down from the State House and move it to an even more prominent location on the Capitol grounds. It took years later and the senseless massacre at another monument I used to pass on my walk to school, Mother Emanuel Church, for lawmakers to finally have the courage to pull down a monument to hate. Pulling down monuments is never easy, but it can be done. The institution of marriage has always been a revered monument within our nation, more so in word than in deed. The monument we built, however, was built on a foundation of exclusion and bigotry and shaped narrowly to define marriage based on the values of the dominant culture. But in our day, we witnessed the legislative monument of exclusion tumble to the ground and the erection of a new monument to equality. Before the legislative monuments came down, however, the hardest work had already been done, not by activists, not by lawyers, not by judges, and not by politicians. The hardest work had already been done by individual men and women who chose to tear down internal monuments, to accept and embrace their gay son, daughter, brother, sister, or friend. That was the hard work. Those are the monuments that are hardest to demolish. In my previous life, and when I say previous life, I refer to my 20s, I was pastor of a Pentecostal church in Georgetown, South Carolina. One of my duties as pastor was to attend all church functions, including the ladies' auxiliary meeting. During those meetings, I was one of two males present, myself and Garth, the 16-year-old son of the ladies' auxiliary president. He was always there because she wouldn't allow him to stay at home alone. Garth and I sat on the back row and waited for the meeting to end. But this particular day was a business meeting, so it lasted much longer than usual. And Garth looked over to me and whispered, "Preacher, let's go to Starbucks." And so we did. And as we were driving to Starbucks, Garth looked over and said, "Preacher, I need to talk to you about something." So I said, "Sure, what is it?" And with trembling lips, he said what I knew he was going to tell me. He said, "Preacher, I'm gay." Then after a period of silence, he asked the really hard question, "Preacher, is it a sin for me to be gay?" Now, Garth had grown up in church all of his life. He was all too familiar with our theological monuments. So when he asked the question, "Is it a sin to be gay?" he was not asking me to give him the canned answer from our church's official doctrine. He was asking me to take an honest look at our theological stones and to tell him what it meant. As I was forced to give an honest consideration to Garth's request, I found that my experience did not match my theological monuments. And tearing it down was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do. But 2 months after my conversation with Garth, I had another series of conversations, one with my board of deacons and another with the superintendent of our church conference. And I resigned my position as minister, turned in my ordination, and the only explanation I could give to them was that our theological monuments did not align with what I knew in my heart to be true. Bringing down old monuments is never easy. And I say this recognizing that we just had a summer of progress in pulling down physical monuments that never should have been erected. I rejoiced to see Confederate statues come down in Richmond, Virginia, Frankfort, Kentucky, Raleigh, North Carolina, just to name a few. As a native person, but more importantly as a decent human being, I was thrilled when a statue of mass murderer Christopher Columbus was tossed into a lake. But whether they came down through legislation or by force, none came down easily. It took our nation seeing a lynching in real time. It took people taking to the streets during a pandemic. It took people looking into their hearts and seeing that our nation's monuments do not match our values, our beliefs, or our memories. The same introspection and honesty that it took to remove those physical monuments is what it will take to bring down monuments that are even more deeply fixed in American society. Systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia. At the Golden Globes in 2018, Oprah Winfrey gave a rousing speech about the destruction of a monument that for too long told men they were entitled to harass and assault women. But she recognized that this powerful monument was finally crumbling when she declared, "Their time is up." Old monuments to patriarchy are crumbling and new monuments are being erected as women speak their truth and men listen. Tearing down monuments is never easy, as this one has proven, but it is possible and it is vital. The only way we can erect new monuments and create a better society for our children is that we proudly and truthfully give answer when our children ask us, "What do these stones mean?" And to give a voice to all people, even the marginalized, even those whose memories, whose experience don't match the monuments. Thank you.